Okay, so hopefully you have something like this potentially in Maya, which is a scene composed of a number of manipulated primitive shapes. Just by using the transform tools to work in face mode, edge mode, and object mode, and vertice mode in order to change and manipulate primitive, primitive objects. There are a couple other tools that I want to introduce you to in this video, but first let me kind of describe what we are aiming for here within this first project. And what we're thinking about is how to compose a two-dimensional rendered image. So a single render view of a three-dimensional scene that is made of abstract shapes, but that functions compositionally like a well-crafted abstract painting, let's say. Okay, so I will be giving some examples of different, two-dimensional works of art that are abstract that you can use to think about how to maybe compose your scene. You need three separate scenes that all have, three separate and distinct scenes and a single view from each of those scenes that, kind of best shows a kind of dynamic composition. And so we'll get more into that later. But this is kind of the beginning, potentially. Something like this might be a start for you for your scene for that first project. Other things that we will be learning before we obviously complete the video tutorial part of this module is how to add lights into the scene, how to add materials to your objects, and also how to model with a different kind of form here, these NURB, curves, and surfaces forms. So that's kind of where we're headed. And then obviously I'll tell you exactly what you need to do to be able to render out your scene. So that all being said, there are a couple other tools that will be really helpful to you to learn at this time. And the first one I want to describe to you is called Duplicate. And the Duplicate tool allows you to copy specific individual objects. For example, here at the base of this strange squid-like shape, I have these spheres that are kind of coming out the back of it. And now I could create this kind of form here by creating a number of spheres and then moving them into place, and then creating another sphere and moving that into place. But that becomes kind of tedious, and there's a much easier way. And what you can think of as a kind of copy and paste function, although you don't want to be copying and pasting, you want to be duplicating. And the reason you don't want to copy and paste is because you don't get a clean copy. You get a transform node attached to it. And so the correct way to copy and paste something in Maya is to use duplicate. So it's very simple. The hotkey is Command D, and so let me go ahead and maybe duplicate this shape here. If I hit Command D, I get, and let me open up my outliner. I'm going to undo so you can see what I just did. I have this thing named Sphere 3. Maybe I'll rename this and call this UFO. Okay, so let me go ahead and duplicate this UFO shape. And you see now I have what's called UFO 1, and it's right in the same exact position as the original. And now I can just translate this down, and I have my copy. Now there's something called duplicate special. So if you want to maybe have more than one copy, we can go over to duplicate special here. And if I, that just duplicated it. Sorry, I wanted to go to my, the option box here. Okay, so it'll bring up my duplicate special options. And so what I can do actually is I can duplicate this object over a certain distance. So I can translate it, let's say 2. in the Y direction, maybe -2, so it goes down 2, and each time I can maybe rotate it by 30 degrees in the Z direction maybe, okay? And so let's just see what that does. And the number of copies I want here maybe is 10 copies. And so let me go ahead now and say duplicate special. And so now I have this group of, well, it's not necessarily a group. It's a number of individual duplicates of that original, but now they've been transformed, translated, and rotated at a particular interval for each copy that's been made. So as you could see, when I tried to move this, it moves everything according to a object orientation. Let me see if I can move it all based on the world orientation, and now I can move this out of the way. Okay, so we can actually see what we have here. Okay, so this is a way that you can make really specific copies of the same object within, you know, a very specific set of parameters that will change what each copy is, what each copy, you know, each copy has, you know, in this case, you know, a rotation of a specific amount and a translation of a specific amount. Okay, we can maybe show you this again by using maybe simply a cube. And another thing you can kind of tell that I'm doing here is you don't have to, this space in Maya is infinitely large and infinitely small. And this grid is not something that you have to maintain your scene on. Your scene can expand anywhere in this world space here. So let me go ahead and duplicate special, edit, duplicate special. And maybe I'll change this to 4 in the Y. No, maybe I'll do 2 in the Y and 2 in the X direction, and I'll rotate it 10 degrees each time in all directions. And I'll also scale it up in all directions by 2. And I'll do this another 10 times, and I'll duplicate special. And now you see I have this long chain of squares that get exponentially larger and also rotate at a specific interval. Okay, so now you can see how you can start to make really specific kind of configurations of, you know, single objects using the duplicate tool. I'm going to go ahead and clear out my outliner. At this point too, we have so many objects in our scene, it might not be a bad idea to rename these by double clicking on any of the objects, just so you know what you're looking at here. And then also remember, whenever you want to look at a particular object and frame it up in the view, you can just hit, I changed this to F, cube renamed, and I can just, in the world space here, just make sure my mouse is hovered over here, frame up this particular object. So, you know, if I'm like way far out in space and I want to get to one particular object that's in my world space, I can just hit F and frame that up, and that will reorient my viewport here to that particular object. Another tool that I want to introduce you to is these snapping tools. So I'm going to go ahead, like I said, and delete everything here in my scene. And I want to talk a little bit about these snapping tools, and I want to talk a little bit about the pivot. So when I make an object, I have a pivot that is located at the center of my object. And I might not want it at the center. And the reason why is if it's at the center and I, let's say, go to rotate, it's going to rotate around that pivot point. So I might want to change where that pivot point is located. And the way I do that is when I have it on translate here, I can press D, just D, not Command D, now just the key D, and I see that I have this little target in the center of my pivot, and I'm able to either click this target and freely move the pivot, or I can move the pivot in a particular axis direction or rotate the pivot if I'd like. And so you can see now, let's say if I instead hover the pivot right above my sphere and I go ahead and rotate, now it's going to rotate around this pivot point. And so that might be something that is useful or helpful to you. Now let's say I want that pivot to exist right at the top of my sphere, at this top vertex. What I can do is, using my snapping tools here, I can snap this pivot right to the top by clicking Snap to Point. And now if I press the D key, it was already pressed, and I can snap it right to the very top of my sphere. Okay, so now, and let's say, and this is something really useful, let's actually snap it to the very bottom. Okay, well, that's not a very good, this is not a flat bottom. So let's do something that has a flat bottom, okay? So let me go ahead and make a cube instead. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off the visibility of my sphere just so we can see the cube. And I want to snap this cube. I want the base of the cube to sit flat on the grid. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on face centers for this cube by going over to Display, Polygons, and I'm going to turn on face centers, and this way now I have generated a point in the center of each face. And now with my snap to point turned on, I'm going to hit D, and I'm going to move my pivot right to the very bottom of my cube. And now I'm going to turn point off, and I'm going to turn on snap to grid, and I'm going to pull my cube up. And now my cube is sitting exactly flat on the grid. Let's say now I have a sphere. Let me make it a little bit smaller. I want this sphere to sit directly on top of my cube, almost like a little sculpture on a pedestal. And so go back to snap to point and move my pivot down to the very bottom of my sphere. Make sure it's really at the bottom because it's actually snapping to a different point. I want it right at the bottom. And now I can snap that point down to the point that's on the cube. So let me turn back on the visibility for this sphere. And maybe I want to snap this sphere right to on top of sphere below it. Okay, so those are some of the snapping tools. Next, I want to talk about just two of our mesh just these three, excuse me. I want to talk about these three mesh tools here: Booleans, combine, and separate. But I'm going to do that actually in the next video.